Okay. Yeah. All right. Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is codenamed Peavy. Peavy has worked within the California public education sector for a number of years now, and we speak about how gender ideology has encroached into California public education and how certain schools within America, and these are public schools, mind you, are allowing children to choose new names and their own gender and where they go to the bathroom and hiding that from their parents. Peavy lays out what parents should be looking for if they are at all worried about this, and how to go about challenging and perhaps changing how gender ideology and other very far leftist or progressive ideologies are advancing through the public education system. One popular method is showing up at the school board meeting and making something viral occur, but there are other ways of going about changing these public institutions, albeit a little bit more subtle and might take more commitment and a longer time to take effect, or at least will do much more than just splashy headlines and a bunch of numbers on a video floating through the internet. This was a very educational conversation for me, and I know that there are a number of parents that will appreciate Peavy's point of view from within inside that system. So without further ado, here is Peavy. So what do you want to tackle? What do you think people should know about?
What I see in these conversations around schools and gender curriculum, there's often kind of a flattening. There's no nuance, and there's a lack of understanding of what's going on the district side. And so I have a unique perspective in that I served on a school board for over 10 years and of a K-12 district in California. And so I got the training that the teachers and site administrators got around things like DEI and gender identity. And then I had a kid of my own. I thought I knew from my training what it all was. Educators think that they know what this is. And then it comes into your own family. You're like, wait a second. What you're describing to me is not what I learned about in my training. And what I see is that a lot of times parents are intimidated to try to address it at their local district, or they address it in a way that is so angry that it's actually less likely to be effective. And I'm hoping that in our conversation that we can touch on some of those ways that, parents may be more effective in first figuring out what is being taught at their school in ways that don't raise the hackles of the educators there, and that can try to kind of protect their kids from some of the prevailing views that are out there. So I hope that we can touch on that today.
Okay. When was the first time that this gender stuff landed against your radar?
Well, I would say it was 5 years ago, which is funny now because I just went back and looked in California. I was looking at the state education code. They have a simple definition of gender, or they think it's a simple definition of gender. And it's actually, I don't know if you've heard the California Ed Code. Gender definition means sex and includes a person's gender identity and gender expression. Gender expression means a person's gender-related appearance and behavior, whether or not stereotypically associated with a person's assigned sex at birth, which is straight out of like Bizarro land and doesn't mean anything and goes in circles. And I looked at that and thought, wow, that's, when did they put that in? Well, they actually put that in 2011. So that was 10 years ago. Okay. And I had no idea. And so it was clearly percolating behind the scenes. It was percolating at the state level, but it hadn't started to drip down to local school boards. And I'm in a very progressive district, very blue. I was elected as a Democrat, and just hadn't heard about any of this. 5 years ago is when I got my first training on what we were talking, transgender children. It had started to appear on the cover of Time magazine, National Geographic. Things were starting to percolate in the national media. But we had a local training for educators by a local nonprofit that focused on trans issues. And that's where, I was first introduced to the genderbread person and, the whole idea that, your sexual orientation is different from your gender identity. And I was like, oh, okay. And when I was listening to it, I thought, what I think most people do think that it's something that typically, younger kids go through, and you know this about a kid when they're 5 or 6 years old. I had no idea that it was starting to jump up in the teen and tween age groups, completely clueless. And then about a year after that, so unbeknownst to me, that same group, it turned out, and I was on the school board, that same group was going into our local schools, the Gay Straight Alliances at our junior highs and high schools, was calling that group in and having them present to the students. And the students were all like, whoa, so it turns out that if I feel uncomfortable in my body and my body's changing and I don't like that, and I wish that I were the opposite sex, that means I'm trans. And my own daughter came to me a year later and said, at that point she was 13, and said, oh, Mom, I think I'm trans. And I was like, oh, I've had training. I know what this is. And then she started talking to me. So the issue is I have 2 older sons. And so when I said to her, tell me more about this, I feel like a boy thing what does that mean? And she couldn't describe anything. It was the first time I realized that there was nothing there. And I was like, wow, you have 2 older brothers. You're not sounding, is there something about them that you relate to? And she's like, well, how are they different from me? And so I started to describe to her what a 13-year-old boy is like. Obviously there's a whole range of the way 13-year-old boys behave, but there are some similarities. My sons are actually quite different from each other, but, they were both at 13, didn't care, for example, about bathing. They were completely obsessed with sex. And there's things happening to their bodies that were changing in a way that actually did make them behave quite differently from the way she behaves and continues to behave. And I described them, and my 13-year-old daughter was utterly horrified. But to her, I think I've come to realize over time, and it took me a long time to figure out where she was coming from, to find alternative viewpoints on this. I finally came to realize that it was really about a rejection of being a girl more than it was an understanding of what it means to be male. Mm-hmm. So that took me some time, and it was really hard. 5 years ago, I'm so grateful, Benjamin, for your videos, for, Fourth Wave Now, for Transgender Trend in the UK. It took so many Google searches to get search terms in that would bring me alternative voices, because everything that parents heard back then was affirmative. And I think it is easier now for parents to find alternatives. But at the same time, in the schools, it has just become more and more pervasive. The type of training around gender identity that they do, and the beliefs that many educators have around it, it's just pervasive. And kids in California are being introduced to these ideas at a younger and younger age. And so I think parents need to understand what what educators are learning, and some methods for protecting their own kids from it. Because if I could go back in time to when I was the parent of a 10-year-old girl, there are some things that I know that I could have done to inoculate her, that I didn't, because I didn't know I needed to, because I didn't, I had no idea this was down the road.
Yeah, yeah. So what were those things generally, like questions to ask or resources?
I think that you can start with, there are some books for very young children. There are some books out there that are very, very bad, like I Am Jazz, for example. They're just like, they reinforce sex stereotypes. And if you wear pink, it means that maybe you're a girl. But there's some really good picture books out there. Of course, Rachel Rooney's My Body Is Me is a classic, but there are also other ones. Pink is for Boys is an example. And even with very young children, you can be talking about how, some people like this, to wear things this way, and some wear things that way. But, there's male and female, your bodies don't ever change, and it's okay to be whatever you want and to dress however you want. And you may hear in school that if a boy likes to wear dresses, that means he's really a girl, but that's really a misunderstanding. And you can phrase it and couch it in whatever language that your child is ready for. But if I could go back and tell a 10-year-old girl that, if you don't like to shave your legs, if it turns out you're frightened of razors and your period freaks you out, that's just really what a lot of girls go through. And we can talk about that when the time comes. And just reframe it so that it's not, so it's normalized to talk about this. And then also just keep saying, you're going to hear it at school. You may hear things at school. People may have these kinds of views, but really that's not foundationally what's going on. And they tend to have other problems with it, and just really address it frankly at home. Not so, well, and it's okay. If your kid goes to school and says, my mom says that what you're saying is wrong, then you can have a conference with the teacher and explain why you think what's going on is wrong. But just, don't be unaware. Don't be clueless about what's happening at your kid's school. It's happening at every public and private school across this country. And don't think that you don't need to address it, that it's something that you can leave to the teachers because you're wrong. And if you have a kid who is facing puberty, if you have a kid who is going through if there's family trauma, if they have other types of mental health issues, if they are neurodivergent in any way, then you have a kid who's at risk of thinking that, maybe a gender identity is what I need, a new gender identity, and that will make me feel better, because I can't fix these other problems that I have, and I can instead redirect all my thinking and thoughts to this issue. Parents need to be really proactive on this.
It is rather obvious, but maybe that's just because I've been listening to voices like yours and young women specifically, and some young men who have gone through varying degrees of wrestling with their gender. But when you were speaking about your daughter coming to you proposing the idea that she's a boy, that she had no actual idea what a boy is. Like, the biology lesson has not been given to her, but this identity lesson has. So she doesn't actually know what she's opting into. Either that or, well, they're hiding it or they're misplacing it. They're not talking about women's puberty, men's puberty, and they're instead talking about basically these profiles that you can be, and that's what means and that means what you are in some way.
Well, it's interesting, and I think that some of the teachers, so in California, the law says in health education that you're supposed to challenge sex stereotypes. But a lot of teachers are confused about that. They're as confused as the trans activists are. And that is, they don't recognize that instead of challenging sex stereotypes, they're, essentially making them concrete and reifying them. And some of the materials that I've seen come through at the school board level, they said things like, they talked about gender stereotypes, like boys like to play football and wear blue, and girls like to wear pink and play field hockey. I mean, I've literally seen these things. And that's all they said. So they'd get material through that said, this is a male stereotype and this is a female stereotype, but there's no challenge to the stereotype. There was no point in any of the lessons or the curriculum that said, but you know what? Some boys like to ice dance, and and some girls like to play football. They never actually take that next step. They stay back a level. And I think my daughter was getting that when the local nonprofit came. That was the message that she was getting, that there's a scale of sort of masculine and feminine expression, and you pick a place on that scale. And it might mean that you're changing your gender identity based on that. But I also think it's very, some of the things that they learn are either overly sexualized. So some of the middle school curriculum has like very graphic lessons that are available on things like anal sex. And then also kind of peculiarly sterile, because they now no longer teach about puberty, for example, the junior high level, they teach it in one group. They used to separate by sex. And you probably remember that there was a time when you went with all the boys and you learned about things that were going to be changing with your body. They worry that may stress kids out who are non-binary. And they worry that it's not inclusive. And so they want to have those lessons all together. So with that, as you might imagine, kids are much less likely to ask questions or to go into great detail about those gory things that happen. And so I think it really does both males and female young adolescents a disservice, because it's not. It's much less likely to be a safe space where you can ask real questions about what's going on. And so while I think my daughter as a 12 and 13-year-old learned about male puberty, it was not in any great detail. And what her brothers are older than her. So she was seeing the cool, 18-year-old when she was a 12 and 13-year-old and thought, oh, that's awesome, right? But she had not she had not been paying attention when he was going through all the horrible stages that he went through. I really think kids it's a disservice to these young kids, and that they really don't understand. Yeah.
Have you seen resources on this non-binary thing, how it's being taught to teachers and to people who work at schools? Is there a concrete definition?
A concrete definition. So when you look at, for example, the California Health Education Framework, and this is probably similar in many blue states, the gender identity tends to be, it's still kind of a circular definition, and it's just about it's more about expression, and they just say that it's an identity. They don't define what they mean by identity. And they include things like using, you should use they, them pronouns to be either gender neutral whenever you can. Starting by the middle school level in California, they really want to make sure that nothing is normalized, that no behavior is normalized, in the sense that, like, it's not normal. They don't want you to think that it's normal for there to be husbands and wives, for example, or for you to be married and have they want you to refer to partners. At the middle school level, the health education says, these students may not be monogamous, and so you don't want to judge that. And you should talk about partners. And you don't want to label sexes or anything like that. And so it doesn't really have a good.
That has a consequence of normalizing the unnormal, though.
Yes, what they're trying to do is make it so if you are, and in some ways it's beautifully inclusive. If you are a very young LGBT person, or if you are very young and very sexually active, and the state doesn't want you to judge that or to create an atmosphere in the school setting where you're judging that. And that can be so helpful in some ways. And in other ways, it can be kind of it's probably a little bit developmentally too much for like the 12-year-old, 13-year-old. There's kind of a funky thing that I see in California where they have different expectations for 6th, 7th, 8th than they do for 9th through 12th graders, for high schoolers. And yet the curriculum providers actually pretty much provide the same materials. And I've seen that again and again, where it's just like, oh, this is actually a high school curriculum on health education, but they've just put middle school in front of it, and it's really the same information. Yeah.
So what are some of the signs that? Okay, well, earlier you said that parents just need to be aware and proactive because this is going to be there.
They do, and it's going to be there no matter what. And I don't think you need to homeschool. I don't think, and frankly, it's in homeschooling groups. And I don't think you need to pull your kid out of school. If I were an elementary and junior high parent, I would be going in towards the beginning of the year and just saying to my teacher, my child's teacher, I am paying attention to some of the new health education material that's coming in. I'm concerned that some of the things that the school is teaching around gender identity in particular might not be very scientific. And so first of all, can you show me what it is that you're using? And based on that, can I have a follow-up meeting with you? Because I would really like to see what's going on. And most teachers, when you couch it that way, are going to be pretty open to at least letting you see the materials. You have a right to see the materials anyway, but normally you would take care of that at the school district office. But it's more, whenever possible, I was like, protect your own kid and take care of it at the ground level. Some of the things that a school district may bring in, like your individual teacher looks at it and would never in a million years touch it with a 10-foot pole. They're going to take the bare bones, what they're required to teach in the law, and they're not going to go any deeper into any of these things that are very problematic. They recognize that. And so if you can have an individual conversation with a teacher, that is something I would do. I would be inoculating my kid at home, and I would be talking individually with the teacher at the beginning of the school year, and I would do it every year. And then when you look at those materials and you see that there are problems, I think it's very fair to be writing to your school board, to be talking to your site principal. But I'm also very aware, because I live in such a very blue area of a very blue state, that some people will shut down around that it shuts off the conversation, that you have to be very careful about the wording. I find, and I have to say that I use my transparent privilege on this. I will often in a discussion say, I'm a parent of a trans child, and you don't need to be unscientific to support trans kids, that you can be loving and inclusive without spreading scientific misinformation. And people are much more likely to hear that from me when I've said I'm the mother of a trans child, than they are from particularly like at the school board level. I watch these meetings sometimes now that I'm not on the board anymore. And I understand the concern from the right, but when people come in, left or right, and you yell and scream at your school board, do adults really need the lesson that you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar? It shocks me what people think is going to be productive. Yelling and screaming at your local elected is not productive. It's just not. And it's much more it's much more effective, and you build, even if you can't get something taken care of immediately, because let me tell you, I mean, I know that there are other Democrats that agree with me on where things are in terms of gender identity curriculum, but they can't. I mean, there's so much pressure if you're elected right now to toe the party line, that if you want to like either hold a line somewhere or make some change, you have to be doing it behind the scenes. You can't do it out in public. And so I think people need to give some of their local electeds grace to do that and not attack them out in public, and just have a behind the scenes conversation. But yeah, my goodness, some of the stuff I've seen these days, I'm like, holy cow. I'm glad I'm
Wait,
not
are you
on that
talking
board
about
anymore.
like these school board meetings and
The
stuff like
school
that?
board meetings,
I've seen
and it goes both ways. It goes both ways. I've seen ones where it's just like, you're trying to destroy healthcare for trans kids. And I've seen ones where it's just like, you're trying to, indoctrinate my child. It's, I understand parents' emotions run high, but when your emotions are running high, and you just need to kind of step back, calm down, pace yourself, and think about, what kind of bridge can I build with this person, with my local board, or who's on that board that I might be able to arrange a meeting with, and just like talk about this calmly, because they're just much more likely to hear you, and maybe in the future, or to notice when something's coming through that is unscientific, because sometimes they've all had the same training that I have. They believe it. They think that what they're doing is helping kids, and they don't recognize the harm they're doing. They really think that they're there to support kids. So,
what are some of the talking points? How do you detect scientific misinformation or unscientific information?
Oh my goodness. Well, some of it is so obvious. It says some of the curricula. And so the California, your state level framework may make it so that it is just the options that come to you at a local level are limited, because they're so like, oh, you must teach about gender identity, you must teach about it, and so people, all of the people that have made the textbooks and the curriculum are all jumping at it in the same way. And but you can look at it, and so really, it is rare. Like, for example, one of the things that I saw coming through said that intersex conditions are common. I think that they put it at something like 10% of the population, and that's why you had to be they were actually framing why you shouldn't use girl and boy and he and she, because you might be like hurting the feelings of the many intersex kids that might be in the room.
1 out of every 10.
And pretty much. And, without any understanding, of course, that children with DSDs have a sex, and that it's in fact offensive to say that they don't. And so it's actually, when you take a look at it, it can be really obvious. And if you have gotten some materials from your teacher, you can just highlight what's there. Ask for a meeting with a school board member and say, do you see here why I might be concerned about this passage here? And just, take it step by step. And it doesn't mean that they'll go back and fix things, because they often can't. There may not be, you may look at every single health education textbook that's available in California and see the same baloney coming through. But at least when it's there, they go, oh, okay, I recognize that. And then when people start talking about like the training that's happening, school board members may start to question that. So it just plants a seed. And in the big scale, I personally am working on planting seeds, mostly I see this much more as an issue with the progressive left, where they just need some questions raised to them. And it's going to take a long time for them to start to see the problems that they have. That's big picture. in the immediate, it's always about protecting your own kid, and it's about making sure that they have correct information themselves, and that you're working with them in that way, and working with your local teacher. But I was really shocked. Did you see Abigail Schreier's posting yesterday of that? What was it? A gender support plan. Did you see that?
The schools had made for a child outside of the cognizance of the parent.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that was Syracuse, New York, that came from. And this is also what floors me, is that you as a parent should be checking your local board policies and your state laws around gender identity. In California, if you have a student that's 12 or older that has a mental health issue, that sees a school counselor, and the school counselor seriously believes that there is the danger of violence or physical harm in the home, and that absolutely happens. And so it's something that, schools have to be careful of. Then a school counselor can withhold that from the parents. But that's it. It's withholding information about a mental health condition where there is a real threat of violence, a real threat, not a perceived threat by the student, but a real threat of violence.
Questioning one's identity is erasing their existence. Is that not?
It
does
has.
It not follow?
It has. None of that makes any sense, Benjamin. So when I look at that, I'm floored. If there is a school district or a site where they are doing this, like Syracuse apparently has been, they are. I hope parents lawyer up and take them up one side and down the other, because that is. Check your board policy, check your state law, but it is rare for a kid, for you to be allowed to withhold information from a parent that could affect their mental health. Yes, I think so many times some of these outside organizations come in and say, it can really rupture family relationship if you tell the parents that a kid has come to you and said that they're gay, for example. And that's one thing. Teachers are going to hear many personal things that a student doesn't want them to share with the parent. And a school and a teacher need to take that into consideration. Sometimes they're a confidant during if there's trauma, family trauma going on at home. That's a whole different story from having a form that you fill out where you've developed a plan. And if you've gone into the student information system and changed pronouns and names and put a big, some kind of header on it, don't tell parents, you are at risk, district. And I've sat on this on the other side as a school board member. We haven't had this particular type of case come forward when I was there. I wouldn't be surprised if it's happened at this point, where where schools are trying to hide this. And of course, this happened in Wisconsin, and it got shot down in Wisconsin. Where
on the level of the court?
So parents took it to I think it's a state court. I don't think it's a regional court. I think it was a state court in Wisconsin, where the school had hidden that they had transitioned the child at school. And the court found for the parents. And they're going to do that all over the country, because this is it's just unconscionable. What you're not taught, and when the training that I got on trans kids, what you're not taught as an educator is that there are so many other things that may be going wrong, that it's so common for a trans kid to have an eating disorder, to be OCD, to have autism, for example, or to be facing some kind of trauma. And I know that many trans activists believe that, okay, well, it's foundational that if you allow the child to transition, then that gender dysphoria will fix everything else. But there's no evidence for that. It could be completely the opposite. And so you may have a kid in a mental health crisis who's presenting with, I want he, him pronouns, I'm a girl at school, but actually foundationally is OCD, is anxious, is no longer sleeping. And that family needs to know what's going on at school so that they can inform the psychiatrist that their kid may be working with or may need to work with. And so when a school is doing this, they just don't understand how they could ultimately be really harming a child and harming a family. And so I hope.
Is a school able to hide mental health issues from parents? Let's say
In
that they're having an
California,
eating
yeah.
disorder.
So in California, the only way that they can do that is if they think that there is a serious and real risk of violence or harm at home. And otherwise, no. If you've gone to the school counselor, and most teachers with various mental, if they see a kid presenting with something that seems like a mental health crisis, will send the child to the school counselor. Then the school counselor will pull the family into the conversation. So that's California. It's probably pretty typical across the West, I would say. Although there may be variations in terms of what specifically they report and don't report. But there's nothing about gender dysphoria or the trans ID that makes it, something that is taboo, that school counselors shouldn't share it with the parents. So they're just going off children at that point. So a child has said, I want to use he, him, I want to change my name, and I want you not to tell my parents. So what I'm curious about is how often as these lawsuits start to percolate and families start to take it further, how often lawyers are reaching out and doing some discovery to figure out who it was that trained the school district. Because I know that Syracuse didn't create that form out of the blue. They worked with a nonprofit that probably was either regional or national, like GLSEN or GLAD, HRC, and they, or a local that had gone through national training along that level, and that form came from somewhere. And I really think it's important for families and their legal counsel to consider pulling in the trainers into any lawsuits. Every place that I've seen, I've seen some of these lawsuits going forward on CRT, for example, and they're always suing the district. Well, where did the district get the training from? Pull in the trainers too. The trainers are, from your experience at Evergreen, there's all these training organizations all over the country, and this is what they do. And nobody holds you may attack the college, but circling back to that specific company, that specific organization, that nonprofit that came in and trained, they need to be held accountable too, or they won't change their message.
I bet those training companies don't have, well, maybe they do, I don't know, if they have whoever hires them sign a non-liability clause, like if they ever get sued for our ideas. If anybody ever comes after you for their child lopping off their breasts because of what we trained, we're not liable for that.
Yeah. It's
a little tongue in cheek, but I just wonder.
Yeah, I don't think so. I honestly think that these organizations are so confident in themselves. And this includes the whole range. This includes the DEI trainers too. I don't know if you saw today's New York Times article on Dalton School and it was more on Paul Rossi there, and the white privileged people getting their privileged DEI training and how that is not going well. But I was just so struck. At one point, one of the consultants that you said, we're following the research. And I'm just like, you're not. There isn't research that shows that this is effective. And if you think that, then you are terribly misinformed. And you're one of the consultants that they're using.
To go back to what you were saying about check the district policies, specifically about the disclosure of child state of mind to the parents.
Mental health.
One, what should parents be looking for that would give a signal of if there's a strong protection of privacy or how privacy is handled in the school? And secondly, is that one line of attack for parents to kind of pressure school districts to put in certain kinds of laws and procedures in place around disclosure of
It is, and
stuff.
it is a way. And so you could be proactive. And so, for example, in California, you could go in and say, look, I know that the law says that you have to be, if it's over 12, there has to be evidence of, a serious risk of violence in the home to not disclose something like a mental health issue. So what educators aren't taught is anything about gender dysphoria. They're taught about the trans child and the identity. They aren't taught that it's a mental health condition. And they aren't taught that there's anything about gender dysphoria and that there's distress. And so that's where I think that there can be some confusion with the educators. But if you as a parent or a parent group want to go in and say, this is what my state law is around disclosure, gender dysphoria is a diagnosis that, at least for now, is in the DSM, and it involves significant mental distress. And so we want to be to not it's going to very much depend on the type of school board that you have, but we want there to be a policy that makes it clear that it's not that you by default tell a parent, that it's going to be explicit, so that we have it in our policies, and there's no confusion with the children, and there's no confusion with the parents. That if you have a child that wants to talk about transition at school, of course, there may be a teacher that they talk to that the teacher's not going to turn around. But if you're talking about a child that wants to bring in all the things that are in the law now in some of our states, like California, where they have the right to their preferred pronouns, where they have the right to use the bathroom based on their gender identity instead of their physical sex, then that is then the parents are pulled in on that. And absolutely, I think that if you are in a district where the elected board members are more moderate, certainly conservative, but certainly moderate, I think that you can be proactive and ask for that type of policy to be in place, so that there's no confusion and no breaking of your state law on it around disclosure to parents. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
From the perspective of a parent dealing closely with a child who's thinking through these things, do you have any tips about, do you want to broach into strategies that you've taken? That's not what we signed up to talk about, and I understand.
Yeah, well, and also I feel like there are better organizations and people than I to talk about that. Okay. I still have a trans-identified kid who's 17, almost 18. And so I wouldn't say that I'm the person to talk to about being successful in getting a kid to open up their mind and see more. I really feel like it's kind of developmental. And I'll be curious to see over time how this plays out. I know that for the younger kids who do this, obviously, there's lots of research on how there's high numbers of desistance rates, and it follows kind of a 5 to 7 year arc. I'm curious to see if that ends up being what plays out for older adolescents and young people as well. But, GenSpect and Parents of ROGD Kids and Transgender Trend and Fourth Wave Now, those are the places that I would be looking for some ideas for how to address the kids themselves.
So there are organizations, and they're rather new, but there are organizations, and there's more to come from what I understand, that will provide parents with resources and probably, the list goes on, for dealing with, stuff within the family. Are there any organizations that you know of that parents and community members can be aware of to understand the proper way to go about policy issues and developing ways of, dealing with gender in the schools and how it's treated in the schools that is proper and that fits into the model of how that bureaucracy runs?
There are some, what I'm seeing on the national level are some organizations that are they tend to be more focused on DEI training and where that's going south. Okay. But they will also address gender ideology training.
Okay.
And so, like FAIR, for example, there are places that you could definitely reach out to, but right now I think their resources are more concentrated on the DEI training. There, there are many places though that will help. There's a regional in Arlington, Virginia. There's a regional group that really is looking at school board policies. I haven't seen it up at the national level yet. And we're just behind. Some places like I'm fortunate that I've got family members who are from the UK. So that was one of the early places I looked for information. And beyond transgender trend there's Safe Schools Alliance, and the UK is relatively small. It's half the size of California in terms of geography. And I think it's easier to spread the message there that there are some problems going on in our schools, and with the conservative government, it was a little bit easier to get that listened to. We're pretty far behind in the U.S. with even recognizing that maybe we're giving our kids misinformation.
Let alone California being in its own particular.
California is its own peculiar spot, that's for sure. Yeah.
Do you see overlap then with regards to how parents are going about the DEI or the CRT push? And do you have any insight into that from your perspective?
I do. And it's so frustrating because I got to be honest. I mean, I have had fantastic DEI training, and I have had pretty bad DEI training, much more towards the evergreen on the scale. And I see, I can really recognize the difference between the two. And I see such a lack of nuance in the national conversation around it, because there's some DEI training where, that actually doesn't try to make you feel like you're a morally corrupt person based on the color of your skin. That actually, if you're working on it at a school level, for example, where you can make real progress in looking at what systems you have in place that are, barriers to an equitable education for all your students, and you can fix some of them based on the training that you have. And, in California, up at the community college level, they don't talk about systemic racism. They talk about systemic barriers to access. And that is, a much less loaded way of talking about it. I think a much more accurate way of talking about it. A lot of times I see that we say racism when we actually don't mean racism. We mean things, in California, there's often poverty is the biggest issue, and language is the biggest issue. And what people try to shortcut that and say, oh, it's based on the color of this person's skin, when really, we're a classist society. We have a majority language, and we make assumptions on, about people that are not in the dominant group in many different ways. And talking about it in terms just of racism is actually detrimental to progress. And so I've been in trainings that recognize that and move forward. They've been terrific DEI trainings. And then I've been ones where, you put posters up all along the side and, list all the ways the white colonials were terrible. And it just but how is this going to help me in the classroom? It's actually
you're
not.
Supposed to teach the kids that.
Yeah. Well, it was, I got to say, at least there was no boat. I watched the boat thing, and
the canoe.
The canoe. Really? Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
I've had some bad training, but nothing to the level of that insanity.
Yeah.
But I just wish that people would open up their minds and recognize that when they go to a school board, or when they go to a college and say, all DEI training is bad and critical race theory is terrible, then it just shuts down a conversation that could happen, instead of going in and saying, this specific thing, I'm concerned, is this happening? First of all, find out, is it even happening? Because, here where I live, it wasn't happening. And
Well,
yet we
all
had
of the
people think that
terms
it
that they
was.
use are umbrella terms. The DEI training organizations, they all kind of use the same term, like equity, but
Yeah.
everybody has a different word for, meaning of
Yep.
that, and they all have, we're going to help out the marginalized. What does that mean?
Yeah.
So I'm still kind of working through my shell shock and my post evergreen stress
Yeah.
on that stuff. So
I think that's permanent PTSD there.
whenever I see that material, I can't even I have a hard time even looking past those words, because I see that, especially in Washington and how it's been rolled out and all the
Yeah.
stuff
Well,
that's
that's
getting
how I feel
pushed to
about
it.
the
So
word gender. I don't know if you read Kathleen Stock's Material Girls, but
I have.
she has
Is it
a.
out yet? I was gonna get it when it's in America. So
I'm out in the I got it from the UK, so I
okay,
don't
yeah,
wait for these things. So,
material. Yeah,
but
I'm gonna
they,
hopefully get to have her on when it gets released next month, I believe.
well, I think you'll really enjoy the conversation, and the book is great. And she lays out like all the different meanings of the word gender. And so to me, I have like, that's such a trigger word for me, gender. So, and I try not to use it except for when we're talking about gender identity, because typically people actually mean sex and sex-based stereotypes.
Yeah,
And so I'm like, Jesus, people, just say what you mean.
yeah,
Say what you
yeah,
mean.
yeah.
And I see a lot of people trying to fight gender ideology who make that same dumb mistake. And I'm like, I can't even listen to you. I would probably be on your side, but I can't listen to you because you're talking
Okay,
about how there are only two genders, and I just can't.
okay, yeah. So broadly speaking, then there are problems with public education writ large with regards to
Not just public,
okay,
private too.
education at large.
Writ
And
large. Yep.
if I know people who are working on stories or content that focuses on education schools, and once you get to that level, you see where most of this stuff is coming from, and those
Yeah.
people matriculate out everywhere.
Yes.
And there are different issues. I think the two big ones, at least in America, there is a third one, but the other two completely cover up this third one, which would be DEI writ large, the racial conversations in America, and then this gender stuff, which are both obscuring this class consciousness or this class conversation that we could be having that might have material there might be material byproducts on focusing on the class of the students, going into a school and seeing how do poor people or students who are deficient of family wealth navigate this place, as opposed to not. There are all these different issues, and it seems like if we can reframe it, like I'm kind of feeling intuitively that you're saying, if you can reframe your attitude toward the system of the education of education, understand that it is a bureaucracy. It's leveled from the state all the way down to your particular school that has some wiggle room in how they manifest the destiny as it is prescribed to them from higher up the chain. But all of every level of the system is all staffed by individuals, and they all have
Yes.
different levels of commitment, and they all have different expectations, political and otherwise, that they have to live up to. So if we can figure out how to reframe the conversations, reframe the language, and probably even just start from the individual to individual level, maybe like start to approach people as human beings and say,
Yes.
here are my
Yes.
concerns.
Yeah. I mean, give grace to your school board, give grace to your politicians, in the sense that left or right, they think that they know what's best for your kids or for your local community, state and national. They want the best for people. You may vehemently disagree that it's the right way forward, but shouting and shaming is not ever a path towards progress, and you won't get your voice heard if you approach it that way. But as I said before, yes, individuals start at the individual level. And I absolutely believe, and I'm an optimist, so I have hope that over time, people will start to see that what they're teaching is regressive, and that what they're teaching is not breaking boxes open, it's making more boxes. And I just think that takes time. And I think for parents of children and teenagers, they don't have time. There's no time right now. Your kid is at risk, and you need to be figuring out what's going on at their school. You need to be much more attentive to this, or unfortunately, you'll be in my shoes, and I don't wish that on anybody.
Any other tips or tricks or insights or anecdotes, maybe?
Well, the funny thing is, I still remember this. Like when the day after my daughter came out to me, I was in a book club at the time with 10 other women. And I went to a book club meeting, and I looked around the room, and I wasn't ready to tell anybody in the room about my daughter's pronouncement, but I was just like, there are 10 of us here. And now I'm the fourth woman who has either a kid, a grandchild, or a niece or nephew who has come out as trans. I'm like, this is a 10-member book club, and 40% of us, I'm like, what is this can't be right. This is crazy. And while it ended up being very hard for me personally, because there was not a lot of information on Google, for example, that I could find. It actually took me a long, long time to find that information. I was super lucky in that locally I had these women in my book club who were complete support, who completely understood where I was coming from. Of those 3 other kids that were trans at the time, within a year after that, 2 had desisted. And the only one that is still trans is the kid that she was medicalized starting at about 13 and had a double mastectomy at 16. And so I just look at that and go, well, I'm always grateful for the other parents that reach out and that have wise words to share about their own experience and the way they've moved forward, and either the way they've come to some acceptance with it, because my goodness, parents' mental health around this. When you have an adult kid in particular, it's just, I see some parents just struggling. And you need to be able to come to a point where you've come to terms with their own decisions, and that they're adults, and kind of let that go. But also for the younger, when you have a younger kid, there are some really practical ways to move forward. And I think that some of the therapists and some of the organizations and parent groups out there have really given a roadmap that's really helpful.
They're not alone.
They are not alone.
Well, I think that's a good place to end it, unless you had one more lob.
That is it. Thank you so much, Benjamin. This has been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I'm curious to see what you end up portraying me as.
I know. Should I surprise you? I'll surprise you.
I'll be happily surprised, I hope, and not freaked out. Thank you.
You won't be Cthulhu, I promise you that.
Oh, thank you. Small favors there. All right, take care.
Congratulations for reaching the end of the discussion. If you enjoyed it, do be sure to leave a review or a comment or a thumbs up or whatever you need to do to show that glorious algorithm that this is some good stuff. And do be sure to go and check that back catalog, as it is brimming full of fantastic conversations. Links to provide monetary support are down there in the description as well. Have a good night.